Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka nabina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajmain. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome, brothers and sisters, to another installment of our weekly series, Analyzing the Address, where we take another look at the khutbah, try to put it under the microscope, talk about it in a little bit additional detail, expand on some of the themes and some of the content that we were not able to talk about extensively given the time constraints of the khutbah, and also offer you an opportunity to even ask questions and give your feedback on the khutbah if you so choose. And yesterday's khutbah was actually a continuation of last week's khutbah, which was titled Allah's Counsel to Muslim Communities. Allah's Counsel to Muslim Communities. And this was part 2 of that series. And as we mentioned at the outset of the khutbah, Allah has dedicated the greater part of Surah Al-Hujurat, because we've been taking certain ayat from Surah Al-Hujurat which consist of or represent Allah's counsel to Muslim communities on their interpersonal relations, etc. And so we talked about how at the outset of the khutbah, we talked about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has dedicated the greater part of Surah Al-Hujurat to the subject of achieving Muslim unity and fostering a cohesive Muslim community. And through the verses of this surah, He counsels the Muslims on interpersonal relations and warns them against those words and deeds which can sow division and cause the believers who should love one another to despise one another instead. And so there's a few points that I want to mention about that preface and the opening statement that we made in the khutbah. And the first point is that whenever we read the Quran, brothers and sisters, we need to be sure that our reading of the Quran is a purpose-driven reading. That we read the Quran with an objective. And the objective in mind, we should read the Quran with an objective not simply for al-barakah. There's nothing wrong with reading the Quran for barakah, and certainly reading the Quran is something which is a great act of worship, a great method or means of remembering Allah. In fact, the best way you can remember Allah is by reciting His words. And certainly this act of worship is mubarakah. It is something which is extremely blessed. As the Prophet said in the one hadith, he said that for every letter that you recite of the Quran, you will receive one hasana, wal hasanatu bi ashri amthaliha, and every good deed will be multiplied up to 10 times its value. And I don't say, the Prophet said, that alif lam mim is a harf, is a letter, but rather alif is a harf, wa lam is a harf, and mim is a harf. Meaning, when the Prophet said letter, because the word letter in the original Arabic, the classical Arabic, could mean a letter, an actual individual letter, or a word. So the Prophet was clarifying that every single letter you recite, if you say, for example, alhamd, alif is a hasana, and lam is a hasana, and ha is a hasana, and mim is a hasana, and dal is a hasana. So the Prophet ﷺ is telling us that this is something extremely mubarak. There's no question about it. But that doesn't mean that that should be the extent of our intention and motivation and what we hope to gain from reading the Quran. Rather, we should go beyond that. Go beyond seeking the barakah and blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the reward from Allah, and seek something beyond that. And the second point I want to make is, what should that objective be? That objective should be to put the Quran into practice. So when we have this purpose-driven reading of the Quran, the purpose that drives us is to understand the Quran in a way that will lead to us putting it into practice in the way that pleases Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the believers thusly, saying, الَّذِينَ آتَيْنَهُمُ الْكِتَابَ يَتْلُونَهُ حَقَّ تِلَاوَتِهِ أُولَٰئِكَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِهِ. He says, those to whom we have given the scripture, they follow it the way it was meant to be followed. أُولَٰئِكَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِهِ. They are the ones who truly believe in it. Believing in the Quran is not just reading it, reciting it for barakah. Believing in the Quran is reciting it to what? A purpose-driven reading which aims, and the goal and objective of it is to put it into practice. And the third point I want to make as relates to this is that chapters like this one, when we're reading the Quran, and we come across these chapters of the Quran, like this Surah Al-Hujurat, which focuses on behavior and social interaction. What does that teach us? When we're saying that we should try to put the Quran into practice, and that's where the true belief in it is demonstrated. That's how we truly worship Allah through the Quran, is by putting the Quran into practice. When we come across these surah and these ayat where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is focusing on behavior and social interaction, that teaches us that worshiping Allah entails more than just rituals. Worship of Allah goes beyond salat, goes beyond az-zakat, goes beyond fasting. That behavior and interpersonal relations are also worship. We worship Allah by how we behave and how we treat other people, specifically the believers, other Muslims. وَصَدَقَ مَنْ قَالَ الدِّينُ مُعَامَلَةٌ. And the person who said religion is interpersonal relations, he spoke the truth in the sense that that's a part of our religion. It's part of worshiping Allah to what? To interact and behave and conduct ourselves and comport ourselves in a specific way, especially as it relates to what? To other people, especially as it relates to other believers. Brothers and sisters, many of us are worshiping Allah on a very basic level and in a very limited way. While Allah wants us to achieve a higher level of devotion and worship Him in a far more comprehensive way. Go beyond the rituals and worship Him through our interpersonal relations, our action, our dealings with other people, to realize that deen goes beyond rituals and encompasses al-mu'amala, interpersonal relations, and how we deal with others and how we behave and comport ourselves. So then we cited the verse in the khutbah. We cited the verse that was going to be the topic of the khutbah. And the khutbah was going to center around this verse from Surah Al-Hujurat. That's the verse, ayah number 6 from Surah Al-Hujurat, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, in ja'akum fasiqun binaba'in fatabayyanu, an tusibu qawman bijahalatin fatusbihu ala ma fa'altum nadimin. O you who believe, if a person of questionable character brings you some news, before taking action, ascertain the truth of what has been relayed to you, lest you harm some people out of ignorance and are forced to regret what you have done. So at the outset of the khutbah, we wanted to give the backdrop, give the backstory, sabab al-nuzul, the precursor to the revelation of the surah. We wanted to do that because it was critical for us to really understand what is being said. We had to put the ayah in the proper and appropriate context. So we mentioned sabab al-nuzul, the precursor to the revelation, the reason for the revelation of these ayat. And we said that it involved a companion by the name of Al-Walid ibn Uqba ibn Abi Mu'ayt, who he assumed he was sent to collect the zakat from Al-Harith ibn Dirar al-Khuza'i and his tribesmen from Bani al-Mustaliq. And prior to Islam, prior to them all becoming Muslims, there had been some bad blood between them. And Al-Walid assumed when he approached their territory and he saw them leaving the territory with they actually had the intention of delivering their zakat to the Messenger of Allah in person, although Al-Walid was sent to collect the zakat from them. So when he saw them coming in a large number in the direction of Al-Madinah from a distance, he assumed, because of the bad blood that had been between them in Al-Jahiliyyah, he assumed that they wanted to kill him. They weren't going to give him the zakat and that they were going to take his life. So he informed the Messenger of Allah accordingly, based upon what he assumed. But his assumption was wrong, and so therefore the information he conveyed was also wrong as well. And that's basically a synopsis of sabab al-nuzul, right? So the verse, it begins, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, O you believe. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He prefaces that and then He prefaces the verse with this phrase, and then follows it by prohibiting us from taking information and acting on it or spreading it if the source of that information is less than credible and before verifying its truthfulness, veracity, accuracy, and so on. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prefaces a verse where He prohibits something with the words, O you who believe, what is He telling us? He's telling us that this behavior is not from faith. Doing it is a sign of weak faith, and also this behavior is not befitting a believer. If we really believe, we will not comport ourselves in this way. We will not conduct ourselves in this way. This is the message This is the message conveyed by beginning the verse by saying, "O you who believe," and then following with what? By prohibiting something. So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "In ja'akum fasiqun binaba'in fatabayyanu." If a person of questionable character brings you some news, right? If a person of questionable character brings you some news, right? And the word used here is fasiq, right? And this word fasiq, it has two meanings. One meaning is the linguistic meaning, the meaning in the language of the Arabs. And that is al-kharij and al-ta'a, or al-kharij and hudud al-ta'a. The one who has exceeded legal limits or gone beyond the boundaries of obedience, right? That's the linguistic meaning. So anybody who does anything wrong, linguistically, can be called a fasiq. Even if what he did is not something that necessarily undermines his credibility, right? But if he did something wrong, he could be called linguistically a fasiq. The second meaning of fasiq is the Islamic or Shari'i meaning of fasiq, and that is man irtakaba kabiratan aw asarra ala irtikab saghira. The one who commits a major sin or persists in the commission of a minor sin. Now this is a person who his credibility is in question because of what? Because of his behavior. Because of his behavior, his credibility automatically becomes in question. That he becomes considered one of the people who is less than credible. Because of what? Because of his sinfulness. Because of his criminal behavior, criminal conduct. All right? So now this verse, it teaches us that the people who carry news, according to Allah, can be divided into one of three categories. And our response to the information they provide depends on the category to which they are assigned. So basically we get two things from this ayah, in ja'akum fasiqun binaba. If a fasiq, if a person of questionable character or questionable credibility brings you some news, Allah basically, in saying this, he basically teaches us two things. One, the people who bring you news are one of three categories. And two, your response to the news they bring depends on which category in which they fall, right? So the first category are those who their credibility is unimpeachable. They are adil, right? The person who is adil. An example of a person who is adil, they have unimpeachable credibility, is the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ, as he's described by his companions, as-sadiq al-masduq. He's the one who always spoke the truth, he never lied. And the information that was conveyed to him by Allah, that he conveyed to us, was always truthful. The source of the information was truth. As-sadiq al-masduq. He told the truth, and he was told the truth. He's absolutely credible. So anything that comes to us from the Prophet ﷺ, we're supposed to accept. And this is important, brothers and sisters, because we live in a time where people, Muslims, will question the Prophet. They will question something which was authentically attributed to the Prophet ﷺ. Okay? There's a famous hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, he said, لَن يُفْلِحُ قَوْمٌ وَلَّوْ أَمْرَهُمْ إِمْرَأَةٌ. He said, a people will not succeed who they appoint a woman as their leader, as their president, as their king, as their queen, etc. The Prophet said this. And some people, they don't like that. So they will what? They will reject what the Prophet said and say that it's wrong. Well, they say it's wrong. The Prophet is what? Is wrong. But we can't do that because the Prophet is what? He's adil. He's a sadiq al-masduq. Everything he says is what? Is truth. As he said in the hadith, he said nothing comes out of this mouth except what? Al-haq. Nothing comes out of this mouth except the truth. So the Prophet ﷺ, it's not befitting for the Muslim to reject anything that the Prophet what? The Prophet says and has been authentically attributed to the Prophet ﷺ. Similarly, the Prophet's companions, they are kulluhum udul. And we're going to talk about that more shortly. All of the Prophet's companions are trustworthy and credible, and if they bring us some news, if something, they say it, and it's authentically attributed to them, we have to what? We have to accept it. So, this group of people, al-udul, or the person who is adil, the one whose credibility is unimpeachable, how do we react to their news, if they bring us some news? Their report should be accepted without question unless there is a legitimate reason to reject it. So if a person who we know is truthful and honest and trustworthy and credible, they bring us some news, we're supposed to accept that news. Unless we have reason to doubt their credibility in that particular case. The second group, according to the ayah, are those who are غير عادل. Those who are, they have no credibility whatsoever.
Like a person who's kadhib, a person who is a kadhib or kadhab, a person who is a liar or a habitual liar. They're always lying. How should we react to that? How should we react to that person's report? That person's report should be rejected outright, unless there's additional evidence that verifies its accuracy. Meaning that if a person is known to be a liar, they're ghair adil, they're not trustworthy, or they're a criminal, right? They're a person who has, as we mentioned earlier, they are murtakib al-kabira, a person who what? They do a major sin, and they're known to do a major sin. That what? That undermines their credibility. And so if they bring us some news, we reject their report outright. Unless what? Unless additional information is provided that shows that they actually were speaking the truth. But their word is never what? It's never taken on its face, on the strength of their statement, their testimony. It's not taken at face value. Rather, we reject it unless what? Unless they can bring proof that what they said is actually true. Last but not least, you have the one whose credibility is uncertain. And this is the one we're dealing with in the ayah. But the way the ayah is worded, it alludes to the other two categories that we mentioned. So the one whose credibility is uncertain, we call him majhul al-hal. He's the one who we're not sure. He could be trustworthy, he may not be trustworthy. We're not 100% sure. This person, how do we behave? The ayah tells us. His report should be investigated and verified before it is acted upon, right? And this is what is intended by al-fasiq fil ayah. The ayah, when it says al-fasiq, it means the one who you're not sure is what he's saying true or false. His hal is majhul. His credibility is what? Is uncertain. So that person, we have to what? نتوقف. نتوقف في خبره. We pause, right? And we don't take his, accept his news outright, or his report outright, or the information he provides outright, nor do we reject it outright. But we do what? We do further investigation. We try to verify. This ayah, brothers and sisters, is the basis for the method of grading a hadith based upon the credibility of the narrators adopted by the muhaddithin. So if you look at the hadith and how they're studied, and how, for example, the scholars will study the hadith and say this hadith is sahih. It is the highest level of authenticity. They'll say this hadith is hasan. This hadith is a hadith which doesn't reach that level, but it is something which we can accept as credible, and definitely something which the Prophet actually said or did, etc. Then they'll say we have a hadith which are da'if, a hadith which are unauthentic, unacceptable, they are rejected. They'll say we have a hadith which are mawdu'at, a hadith which are fabricated. Part of the way that they, part of the process of reaching those conclusions has to do with the credibility of the narrators. And how did the scholars divide these narrators into people who we accept their narration outright? These narrators who what? Natawaqqaf. We don't reject their narrations and we don't accept them, but we do what? We try to verify the truthfulness of what they said. And these narrators who we reject their narrations outright, how did they divide into these categories? Using this ayah as a basis for these principles. As we said, the ayah basically, the wording of the ayah divides people into three categories and gives us three ways to respond to the news according to these categories. Now there is an ishkal. It's a little bit of a problem. If you look at the ayah itself and you look at sabab al-nuzul and you look at the precursor or the reason for the revelation, and that is that, as we said, it involves the Sahabi Al-Walid ibn Uqba ibn Abi Mu'ayt. And how this Sahabi, how he came to the Prophet with some news based upon an assumption, based upon a perception that turned out not to be true, and therefore his statement turned out not to be true. So we're taught, according to the scholars, there is unanimous agreement. And the scholars of hadith have mentioned this, a great number of them, among them Ibn Salah and Al-Ala'i, and other scholars of hadith and other scholars of other funun, other disciplines, have all mentioned the unanimous agreement of the scholars that all the companions are udul. All of them, without exception, are credible and trustworthy. But how do we reconcile between this and the use of the word fasiq to describe Al-Walid? And the scholars basically have three answers to this ishkal, this problematic issue as it relates to the explanation of Surah ayah number 6 from Surah Al-Hujurat. The first one is that the verse was revealed generally to teach the believers how to respond to news from a fasiq. And this incident, the incident of Al-Walid and Al-Harith and Bani al-Mustaliq, was deemed an appropriate precursor for the revelation, but the verse was not revealed regarding Al-Walid specifically. Meaning the verse is not calling Al-Walid Al-Fasiq, but the situation was the perfect situation for this ayah to be revealed and to call the attention to the believers that sometimes you're going to receive news. That news may come from someone who's less than credible, and this is how you should behave. But Al-Walid is not being called a fasiq, or when Allah says fasiqun, he's not talking about Al-Walid. And they justify that by saying that Al-Walid, he informed the Prophet ﷺ based upon an assumption which turned out to be incorrect, and therefore what Al-Walid did was a mistake. Akhta. He made a mistake. And the one who errs by accident is called a mukhti. He's called a person who is mistaken, he's at fault, he's in error, but he's not called a fasiq. He's not called someone who's rebellious, sinful, or wicked. Why? Because he didn't do so intentionally, he did it by accident. The person who makes a mistake and says something wrong by accident is not the same as the one who does it on purpose. And so they can't be equated, and therefore Al-Walid is not, by making a mistake, that mistake did not make him a fasiq. The second answer that the scholars give, and that first answer was mentioned by Al-Razi in his tafsir. The second answer that the scholars give is that the intended meaning of al-fisq in this ayah is al-fisq al-lughawi, the linguistic meaning of the term, and we talked about linguistic versus the Sharia meaning. And al-fisq al-lughawi, as we said, is a person who what? They exceeded the limits, the legal limits. They went outside the bounds of obedience. And a person who commits one sin by mistake is not considered a fasiq. And the Islamic meaning, which would undermine his credibility, is not the one that's intended. And this was mentioned by Zurqani. Last but not least, from the explanations that the scholars have given, is that the companions, at the end of the day, they're human. They make mistakes and even commit major and minor sins. But they occupy a special status because of their seniority and virtue. If they sin, their sin does not undermine their credibility in the way it does with those who came after them. They have a special status. Why? Because it is certain that they either repented and were forgiven, or they did good deeds which erased the sin from their account, or they were pardoned by Allah because they were the forebears of His religion, or because of the Prophet's intercession which they are more entitled to than anyone else, or due to a trial that they endured which allowed their sin to be expiated, that basically the companions are special. And they have been given a special status of credibility and adala that nobody else has been given. And any mark that you may be able to find on their record, however their record may be slightly or greatly besmirched, they still occupy this special status because they're the companions of Rasulullah. And this explanation was provided by Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullahu ta'ala. So these are three explanations which basically respond to and deal with and address the problematic issue that comes from this word al-fasiq when you couple it with the sabab al-nuzul, the reason for revelation. Allah goes on and He says, إِن جَاءَكُمْ فَاسِقٌ بِنَبَإٍ فَتَبَيَّنُوا. He says, before taking action, ascertain the truth of what has been relayed. Now I want you to think about this, brothers and sisters. This ayah was revealed in the context of a non-religious matter, right? It was revealed in the issue of a non-religious matter. It wasn't talking about, for example, a person telling you about how to worship, how many raka'at in dhuhr, whether or not a person, if they're fasting, are they allowed to get cupped or not? It doesn't deal with a religious or ritual issue. It doesn't deal with aqidah, what we're supposed to believe, right? it dealt more with what? With a worldly related issue, but in that issue, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in جَاءَكُمْ فَاسِقٌ بِنَبَإٍ فَتَبَيَّنُوا. If a person of less than credible, who's less than credible, questionable credibility, comes to you with some news, clarify, verify. If this is the case with non-religious news, how much more should it be the case? How much more caution should we exercise when the information is related to our religion? We have to be careful, brothers and sisters, not just to take our religious knowledge from every Tom, Dick, and Ahmed who preaches or teaches in the name of Islam. We have to verify the truth and accuracy of what these imams and Muslim evangelicals are saying. If we have to be careful about non-religious news, we have to be even more careful about religious news. So Allah subhanahu, that's why Allah says, فَتَبَيَّنُوا. Verify, investigate, scrutinize what you're being told. Are their views supported by the primary source of Islam, Al-Quran and Sunnah? The primary source of truth, the primary source of our religion is Quran and Hadith. So if a person is going to tell us, believe this, don't believe that, do this, don't do that, and it relates to the deen, then they should be able to back that up with the Quran and Hadith. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قُلْ هَاتُوا بُرْهَانَكُمْ إِن كُنْتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. Produce your proof, your evidence to support your arguments if you're telling the truth. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِن تَنَازَعْتُمْ فِي شَيْءٍ فَرُدُّوهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ إِن كُنْتُمْ تُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ ذَلِكَ خَيْرٌ وَأَحْسَنُ تَأْوِيلًا. He says if you differ in any matter, if there's some religious issue and you're confused about it, then take it back to Allah and His Messenger, the Quran and Hadith. إِن كُنْتُمْ تُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ. If you truly believe in Allah on the last day, ذَلِكَ خَيْرٌ, that is better, وَأَحْسَنُ تَأْوِيلًا, and most superior for or most suitable for final determination. You want to know what the truth is? Take it back to Allah and His Messenger, the Quran and Hadith. Also, these opinions that they give us, are they consistent with those of the reputable scholars of Islam, past and present? It's another thing too. A person can quote Quran and Hadith all day long, but they can misinterpret, they can twist it. So when they quote the Quran to support their views, they should be able to show us that the scholars before them, or scholars of this time, hold the same view. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, go beyond the Quran and Hadith and make sure that what you understand is the understanding of the believers. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَن يُشَاقِقِ الرَّسُولِ مِن بَعْدِ مَا تَبَيَّنَ لَهُ الْهُدَى وَيَتَّبِعْ غَيْرَ سَبِيلِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. He says, those who contradict and oppose the messenger after the clear guidance has become clear to them, and they follow a path other than the path of the believers, نُوَلِّهِ مَا تَوَلَّى. We will entrust them to the path they have chosen for themselves. وَنُسْلِهِ جَهَنَّمْ, and we will burn them in hell. وَسَاءَتْ مَصِيرًا, and what an evil destination or abode that is. Allah is threatening the people who fail to do two things. Follow the guidance as revealed, Quran and Hadith, and as understood by the believers. Meaning what? The knowledgeable, the scholarly people, the people who are put in a position to interpret the Quran and Sunnah the way it's supposed to be interpreted. Right? And there's a famous statement that the earliest Muslim scholars used to say, لا تتكلم عن مسألة لا تتكلم في مسألة ليس لك فيها إمام. Don't speak about an issue unless you have what? A precedent. Somebody you can say, hey, this is not coming from me. I didn't take this out of my pocket. This is what the Muslims have been saying since time immemorial. This is critical for us, brothers and sisters. And so we have to be like this. We have to scrutinize these reports in this way. Person says something about the deen, we take a step back. Can he support it with Quran and Hadith? Check. His interpretation of Quran and Hadith is supported by what? By the understanding of scholars past and present. Check. We accept it. If we can't check those two boxes, we reject it. The Prophet warned us, brothers and sisters, that there would come a time when imams would appear who would mislead, and it's imams who would feign knowledge that they don't really have, and they would give religious verdicts based upon ignorance and lead people astray. So you have some imams who are what? They're misguided, and some imams who misguide. The Prophet warned that this would happen. So our what? Our antennas have to be up, and we have to scrutinize so we make sure that whoever we're taking from is not from these imams that the Prophet warned against. He said, أَخْوَفُ مَا أَخَافُ عَلَيْكُمْ أَلَئِمَّا الْمُضِلِّينَ. What I fear for you the most are those scholars who will mislead you, misguide you. Those people who will wear the cloak of scholarship, but they'll say things which contradict the deen. He also said, اتخذوا رؤوسا جهالا فأفتوا بغير علم فأفتوا بغير علم فضلوا وأضلوا. He said, people will come who will take ignorant people as their leaders. People who really don't have the competency. They'll take them as their leaders. And those incompetent imams will give verdicts based upon ignorance. Those imams will go astray and they'll lead others astray. The Prophet warned about this, and this is why the early Muslims and scholars throughout history, even in our time, they're constantly warning their pupils to be careful. As Muhammad ibn Sirin used to say, إِنَّ هَذَا الْعِلْمَ دِينٌ فَانظُرُوا عَمَّنْ تَأْخُذُونَ دِينَكُمْ. This knowledge is a knowledge of the religion of Allah, so be careful from whom you take your knowledge. And so therefore we know it's wrong for people to criticize Muslims who scrutinize the information that they're given. Muslims who ask for proof. Muslims who ask for a salaf. They ask for a precedent. They ask for some scholar who said it or shared the same view that they're being what? That they're being given. People get angry at those people. Oh, they call them the authenticity police. This is wrong. We're supposed to be keen to what? To find out what is authentic from what is inauthentic, what is correct from what is incorrect. And we have every right to scrutinize the fatwa, the verdicts, the actions, the statements, the teachings of any and every imam, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us that right. In ja'akum fasiqun binaba'in fatabayyanu. If somebody comes to you with some news and they're less than credible, you have reason to doubt what they're saying, fatabayyanu. Scrutinize, investigate, verify the truthfulness and veracity and accuracy of what they are saying. Then we close the khutbah, brothers and sisters, with a passage which read. This verse also teaches us, the end of the surah, the end of the verse, it ends in this way. أَن تُصِيبُوا قَوْمًا بِجَهَالَةٍ فَتُصْبِحُوا عَلَى مَا فَعَلْتُمْ نَادِمِينَ. So in this part of the verse, Allah explains what the hikmah, the wisdom behind why He's telling the Muslims that if some news comes to them, they should verify it and not just act on it or speak on it without what? Without first verifying it. And then we close with a passage which I want to comment on. That passage reads, this verse also teaches us to avoid making assumptions or believing whatever is said about a person or people, good or bad, based purely upon how we personally feel about them. We may have an idea about a person or some people, like the idea Al-Walid had about Al-Harith and his tribesmen. But before we act upon it or spread it to others, we need to confirm that what we think is right and not merely a product of our own prejudice. Now, there are a couple of things I want to say ala ujara before we close. The first one is that the word news, naba, in the ayah is general. Nakiratun fi siyaq ash-shart. It is an indefinite noun in the context of a condition. And that indicates generality and all inclusiveness. And therefore, it encompasses any and all news, good or bad, from someone who is less than trustworthy or credible. So if you look at the backstory, also it provides what? Even more context, indicating how the verse should be interpreted and understood. And Walid, because of the bad blood between him and Bani al-Mustaliq, he assumed the worst about them and spoke based upon his assumption, rather than based upon certain knowledge. Put those two together. Any news, good or bad, because the word is general. Also, look at the context. Al-Walid assumed the worst because of the bad blood between him and Bani al-Mustaliq before what? Before Islam. Put that together, and you can conclude that what? That we have to be careful about passing judgment on other people, and make sure that when we pass judgment on other people, it's not based upon what? Bias, prejudice, personal prejudice, bad blood between us and them, about how we feel about them. Basically, and this is important, why, brothers and sisters, because developing an opinion about people based upon personal prejudice or implicit bias as opposed to first-hand knowledge, experience, or religious reasoning. This is underline that, religious reasoning, meaning that The deen tells me to view a person who does certain things or says certain things or behaves a certain way. The deen tells me to look at them a certain way. But a lot of times we do the opposite. The deen tells us to love people who do certain things, and we hate those people. And we hate them because of those things. The deen tells men to grow a beard, and you actually have some people who hate you because you grow a beard. The deen tells you to basically keep, for a male, to keep your garments above your ankles. And some people will hate you and despise you and mistreat you. One of the recommended things, it's not obligatory, but one of the recommended things in the deen is for women to cover their faces with veils. It's recommended. The Prophet's wives all did it. And it's been done throughout Muslim history. And all the scholars of Islam agree that wearing the veil is mustahab. Now they disagree about whether it's wajib or not, but at the very least they all agree it's something recommended. It's part of the deen. And you actually have people who get angry and they despise women who wear the veils, and they even mock them and ridicule them and call them names. So religious reasoning is important too. A lot of times we develop an opinion about a person that contradicts the religious reasoning, and that's wrong. And this occurs quite frequently. We have to always scrutinize our own judgment. Not just the judgment of other people, we're going to get to that, but our own judgment. I don't like this guy. He's a bad guy. He's no good. Why? Why do I feel like this? I need to be honest with myself. Why do I feel like that about so-and-so and such and such? We have to scrutinize our own judgment and the judgment of others. What is the basis for my assessment of such and such individual or group? Why do I like them? Why do I dislike them? I always have to question that. This is one of the things that this verse is teaching us, brothers and sisters, that we can't judge people based upon assumptions or based upon prejudice or implicit bias, and we don't have any first-hand knowledge to support what we feel about them, and we don't have a religious basis to support what we feel about them. Am I supporting? We have to ask ourselves, am I supporting or opposing him or her based upon knowledge or ignorance? With or without bias, in accordance with the teachings of Islam or in opposition to them. And I want to give two examples ala ujala. Since I first became Muslim and, all the way up to now, I've been a Muslim for a while. I'm not going to date myself, but I've been Muslim for a while. I've always come in contact with different Muslims from different parts of the world, and the general consensus is a hatred, a contempt towards Saudis, people from Saudi Arabia. And some people will actually explicitly try to encourage you and teach you to despise these people. Now, I want to be clear. Some people will say I mention this because I'm a Saudi apologist. And the reason why I'm an apologist is because I studied there. And nothing could be further from the truth. I'm not apologizing for them or even defending them because I studied there. But rather, I'm saying what I'm saying because we have to think about why we hate these people, despise these people, have so much contempt, so much angst towards these people. Is it because of something that they do, a way that they behave, and what they do and the way they behave is against the religion? So I'm despising them, disliking them, holding them in contempt because of something they do that violates the religion. I have a religious reason or basis. Is this reason or basis something that I've experienced firsthand? I have firsthand knowledge of it, or is something that somebody else said, and now because of that I have implicit or explicit bias towards them, but not something I can say basically I've experienced this from them. Last but not least, and this is the important one, are there other people who do the same thing? Other people from other countries or another country that does the exact same thing or something even worse, and I don't have the same hatred, contempt, dislike, angst towards them? If so, then what? Then that tells me that this is a personal prejudice based upon the way I feel about these particular people, justified or unjustified. This is how we have to basically look at ourselves in order to comply with the teachings of the ayah and worship Allah by applying the ayah, living the ayah. This is so important, brothers and sisters. You want to hate the Saudis, hate them. But hate them based upon first-hand knowledge. Hate them based upon something that they do that violates their religion. And if there are other people who do the same thing or do things even worse, then hate them also. And this is where you can see, if we don't do that, then what? There's bias there. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us in a roundabout way in this ayah that we can't conduct our business like that. Especially when it comes to other believers. At the end of the day, the Saudis are believers. They're people who pray 5 times a day. They're people who believe in the Tawheed. So if you're hating them and you want to hate them, that's up to you. That's between you and Allah, and that's fine. But if you're going to hate them, check all these boxes. I'll give another example because some people might not like the Saudi example, right? Because we want to hate them and we want everybody to encourage us to hate them. But for example, let's say you have people, for example, they're into what they call universal sighting, Tawheed al-Ru'ya, when it comes to the moon. Which means if it's seen anywhere in the world and the people who see it are credible people, they're trustworthy people, they're not fusaq, they're from the udul, they're from people who, as we said, they're people who their credibility is unimpeachable. If they tell us that they've seen the moon, we're supposed to accept their sighting. And we have lots of people who are from that opinion, and jazakumullah khairan, that's a very good opinion, and one of the credible opinions, valid opinions regarding the whole issue of how do we determine the beginning and end of the lunar months, the Islamic months. But if that's your position, and then the moon is seen by a country or a group of countries that you hold in contempt, but the people who convey that sighting, their credibility is unimpeachable, but you reject it anyway. You say, yeah, I'm from the people of Tawheed al-Ru'ya, but I'm not going to accept it from those people. Then you have to ask yourself, why do I behave differently when the information came from those people, even though they fit the criteria for their khabar, for their news, for their naba to be accepted? It must be because of what? Because of personal bias and the way we feel about them. And that is wrong according to this ayah. Be nas in ayah. We're not supposed to behave like this. And we have to understand that if we behave like this, we're not worshiping Allah the way we're supposed to worship Him, because as we said, worship of Allah goes beyond the rituals and encompasses these interpersonal relations. And Allah is telling us how to follow these relations, how to apply these relations or interpersonal relations, these rules and regulations, guidelines of interpersonal relations in a way that pleases Him and earns us His reward. We also have to realize that we are doing something, as we mentioned in the khutbah, which is actually, it undermines the achievement of Muslim unity and the fostering of a cohesive Muslim community. Because imagine how the people who their word was rejected with no other reason or cause or justification than the fact that we have a personal prejudice against them. How is that going to bring us together as a Muslim community? That tears us apart. That tears us apart. And everybody just goes off to their own group, their own sub-community, and they have ill feelings toward the people who mistreated them or rejected their unimpeachable, their report, even though their credibility was unimpeachable, simply because of what? A personal prejudice or implicit bias that they had. So I want to just close, brothers and sisters, by saying, remember, the goal is to read, study, contemplate, and interpret the Quran in order to apply it as Allah intended. To live the Quran, brothers and sisters. Live a life guided by the Quran and not in opposition to it. In order for us to apply the Quran as Allah intended, in order for us to do that, we have to read the Quran with that purpose-driven reading, try to understand it so we can apply it correctly. And as it relates to this, we have to behave the way the Quran is telling us to behave as it relates to what other Muslims and their reports, and have the interpersonal relations that Allah has encouraged us to have in this ayah. And with that, we bring the session to a close. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as always, to bless your houses, to bless your spouses, to bless you and to make you blessed wherever you may be. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from those who listen to the talk and follow the best of it, And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from those who He teaches beneficial knowledge, and we truly benefit from that knowledge by making us from those who put into practice. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.